was also certified through the American Board of Criminalistics.
And have you ever had an occasion to testify previously in the field of, or as a microanalyst?
I have.
And specifically, have you ever been tendered as an expert?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury what fields you've been tendered as an expert in, if you recall?
Well, the various fields in trace, hairs, fibers, glass, wood, shoe and tire examinations, chemical examinations of various types would be included in that.
And could you estimate for the jury how many times you've had an occasion to testify as an expert in the state of Georgia?
Over 400 times.
Have you ever testified outside the state of Georgia?
Yes.
And any idea how many times you've testified outside the state of Georgia?
I would estimate maybe a dozen or so.
Okay. And when you testified outside the state of Georgia, were you also deemed an expert at that time, or at least some of those times?
Yes, so I've testified in federal courts outside of the state. Also, in my post-retirement, I worked for the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Laboratory for almost 10 years. I testified in different parts of the country as part of that job as well.
And your job with, I'm just going to say with the Army, with the crime lab of the Army, did you do similar work to what you did with the GBI?
I did.
And how long did you say you had that particular job?
Over 9 years.
Your Honor, at this time we would move to tender him as an expert in the field of trace evidence.
All right, any objection for Board Dyer as to his qualifications in his field of trace evidence analysis?
Not as his fault.
All right, thank you, Mr. Burchett. Ladies and gentlemen, the law recognizes two types of witnesses. Lay witnesses, which is just like an eyewitness that would come in and just testify something they saw. And then the law recognizes what are called expert witnesses. This witness has been tendered by the state and accepted by the defense as an expert because of his training and experience in his field of forensic microscopic evidence analysis. Okay? Things that are typically beyond the keen of the average juror, what expert witnesses are here for to help the jurors. Okay? You're to give his testimony, whatever amount of credibility you believe it's entitled to, just as you would any other witness. Okay? Thank y'all. Go ahead, Ms. Mark.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson, I want to direct your attention to October, November of 2005. Were you employed with the crime lab at that time?
I was.
And at that time, would you have been employed simply as a microanalyst, or were you already working as a technical leader as well?
I was both technical leader and as microanalyst.
Do you recall an occasion in which you met with then Special Agent in Charge Gary Rothwell out of the Perry office?
I did. In fact, he had called me on the phone indicating he was en route to the laboratory, asking questions about a glove that had been recovered from the scene of a missing person and was wanting to inquire as to what types of procedures could be done with the glove.
Okay. And did Agent Rothwell specifically deliver the glove to the crime lab himself?
He did.
Can I correct you with this, Judge?
Sure.
I'm going to show you the Market States Exhibit 148, and I ask you to take a look at that for me. Sorry to show them to the defense counsel.
Yes.
Now, looking at States Exhibit 148, do you recognize what that is?
Yes, this was the glove that was received at the laboratory. It's marked with a label with a specific crime laboratory case number and item number.
Okay. Now, to be clear, the picture you're looking at, can you actually see the glove in the picture?
No.
So what is that a picture of?
It's actually what we would call an evidence bag or a brown paper bag that's sealed with markings of evidence tape, which was indicated as containing the glove.
And you've talked about the fact that it's labeled with a sticker. When evidence arrives at the crime lab, no matter how it gets there, is it labeled with a number that is specific to the crime lab itself?
It has a very specific number and an item number, and also has a barcode as a part of that label for tracking purposes and transfers of internal transfers of the evidence.
And that particular that crime lab number, does that apply to each piece of evidence that's submitted in a particular case, generally?
Yes.
Okay. And in this particular case, looking at the exhibit in front of you, States Exhibit 148, does the number listed on that bag match the case number in this case that was given to it by the Department of Forensic Sciences?
It does.
All right, this time I would tender States Exhibit 140, I've already forgotten my number. In the evidence, 148, thank you.
Any objection? Thank you, that's admitted without objection.
Okay. Now, you've referenced it as being the glove. I want to should come up on your screen. That's fine. Okay. Now that the jury has the ability to see it as well, can you tell them again what they're looking at, please?
Again, so this brown bag with the red evidence label tape sealing the top of the bag has a label with a green stripe across the top labeled 2005-1025070, and then smaller lettering below that, it says item number 1.
And this particular paper bag that we're looking at, this evidence bag, did this contain an item of evidence that you later analyzed yourself?
It does.
And what was contained within that bag?
There was a latex tied off-white glove.
Okay. I'm going to show you what I've marked as State's Exhibits 149, 150, 151, and 152. I'll ask you to take a look at those for me, please. Those also have been shown to opposing counsel. It's okay. You're not the only one. I've done it all day, too.
Yes, I recognize these.
And as to each of those photographs, you said you recognize those. What do you recognize those to be?
These are images that I took in the laboratory during the time I performed examinations on the glove.
And are those true and accurate depictions of what the glove looked like during the time it was in your custody at the crime lab?
They are.
All right, this time I would tender those exhibits into evidence.
All right, 149, 150, 151, and 152. Mr. Merchant, any objection? No objection. Thank you. Those are admitted without objection.
And may I publish those to the jury?
Yes.
Looking first at States 149, can you tell the jury what they're looking at there, please?
So this image is of one side of the glove before I performed any examinations.
Okay.
So in looking at the condition of the glove, I noticed that there were discolorations in the glove from kind of an off-white color to a darkish yellow colorations, which would indicate to me that the glove appeared to have been used, and also the fact that the thumb and the pinky finger of the glove, the tips are inverted in, which would be a common expectation if you were to remove a glove, that the tips would remain inverted after you remove the glove.
Okay. So looking at this particular exhibit, is this the condition in which the glove arrived to your lab?
It is.
Okay. And then looking at State's Exhibit 150, can you tell the jury what you're viewing there? Oh, I'm sorry, it's the wrong one. State's Exhibit 151. What are we looking at there?
So states that 151 would be the opposite side of the glove than 149. So there is less discoloration there in that. You can still see evidence of where the thumb and the pinky tips of the fingers, where the glove is inverted.
Okay. So if I understand, it's just the opposite side of the glove?
Correct.
Did you at any point, however, well, let me ask you this first. While the glove was in this condition, the condition in which you were given it, did you do any testing?
After the image was taken, I placed the glove under a low power microscope, we call it a stereo microscope, and I examined the glove for the presence of any hairs and fibers, principally. Also, could there be any evidence on it of a dried residue of a solid material of any kind that could be useful, potentially investigatively, or at a later stage for a comparison on the surface of the glove. And I recovered several small textile fibers on a piece of tape and isolated that.
Okay. Did you at any point locate anything else on this glove of evidentiary value?
Well, as part of the subsequent examination, when I removed pieces of the tape, I noticed that there was a whitish residue in addition to the fibers recovered. And so I removed part of that residue to determine what the white residue might be, and determined that they were starch grains. So that indicated to me that It supplemented the fact that I believe that the glove was inside out because it was evidence that it was a powder glove.
Okay. Now you've mentioned starch. To be clear, is that a particular, obviously we've all heard of starch, but is that a particular substance that you can look at under the microscope and identify these small particles are in fact starch?
Yes, starch has a very particular microscopic appearance.
You talked about that indicated to you something about the glove. Explain to me why starch on this side that we're looking at of the glove would indicate to you that it was inside out, please?
Well, a manufacturer would starch the inside of the glove just to make the glove easier to place onto the hand.
Okay. Did you, and obviously we're going to look at that in a second, but did you notice any of those starch materials on the inverse side of the glove once you flipped it inside out?
I did not.
You talked about some fibers, I believe that was the term you used. Sitting here today, can you tell this jury what those fibers actually were?
I did not make any detailed notes of what the fibers were. They were small, typical kind of fibers you expect from clothing type items. So they were not carpet fibers or something that could have been of immediate use investigatively. So if a comparison were to be done later, then those items could be retained back out and it could be part of a comparison. If they were there in a large number of the same type, color, and appearance, then perhaps I would have made some note of that because maybe that could have been useful investigatively.
In this particular case, though, were there a large number of those fibers?
No.
In this case, are you familiar with how long after the murder occurred someone was arrested?
I am not.
Okay. So let me ask you this. If you, in this case, lifted fibers in 2005 and the person who was arrested for the murder wasn't arrested in 2017, based on your 30 years of experience, are you likely to have anything to compare those fibers to 12 years later?
Well, without any ability to identify a potential source, there could be any number of potential sources in terms of clothing that long after the fact. It would be very difficult.
Okay. What about, and again, I know you can't tell us for certain, but with the fibers you would expect to see from a blanket or a quilt, could those be similar to what you would expect to see from clothing, the fiber clothing?
It can't say it's not possible, but that would not be typical.
Okay. Now, moving on to State's Exhibit 150, can you tell the jury what we are looking at there?
So this was the side of the glove that with the discolorations after I had turned the gloves proper side out. So they were received in an inside out condition and I inverted them back into their original correct position so that I could also examine that side of the glove for evidence as well.
And is this a picture of that?
It is.
And then finally, looking at State's Exhibit 152, can you tell the jury what we're looking at there?
So this is the glove which I had marked as side B. So this would have been the non-discolored side after the gloves were placed into their original condition, that is turning the inside out, inside out.
Other than the items we've talked about, that being the few fibers and the starch, did you locate any other trace evidence on the glove?
There were no hairs on either side of the glove, inside or outside, and I did not note any other physical evidence that seemed to be pertinent from a trace evidence standpoint.
Now, as technical leader, moving from your job as a microanalyst to technical leader, were you involved, and I don't want to go into what other people said, but were you involved in discussions about how this particular glove was going to be analyzed with latent prints versus biology?
I did. After I received a call from Gary Rothwell en route to the laboratory, I informed him that I would contact the DNA unit and the latent print unit and would attempt to coordinate what would happen after my examination was done, find out what what type of procedures, where would the evidence go, what would be the flow of the evidence after I was complete with my examination.
And after you completed your examination, what did you do with the glove, if anything?
Well, I resealed the glove and transferred the glove to a Philip Prater person in the Latent Prints unit.
And who is Philip Prater? And you just said where he worked, but can you tell me who that is, please?
He's a laboratory technician with the Latent Print unit.
Okay. Trying to find the best place to cut this. For record purposes, judges, this has been marked as State Exhibit 170. I'm going to show you an item that I just removed from item 170, labeled as 170A. Can you take a look at that for me, please?
Yes,
Do you recognize that particular item?
I do. This was the original container that the evidence was submitted in.
And how do you recognize that particular item?
Well, it contains the label that we discussed earlier from the laboratory, the official 2005-1025070 label. It also has my initials and date on a seal that I placed after my examination.
Your Honor, at this time I will tender into evidence State Exhibit 170A.
Any objection, Mr. Merchant? That's submitted without objection. Thank you.
In addition to your label at the bottom, do you see if anyone else has opened this bag after you sealed it back up? Are you able to tell?
There is an additional seal on top of my seal.
Okay. And what are the initials of that seal?
Appears to be a PP.
PP. Thank you. I don't have any further questions at this time.
All right, any cross-examination, Mr. Merchant?
Good afternoon, sir. My name is John Rich. I represent Ryan Duke.
Yes, sir.
Good to see you today. So as I understand it, the only thing you did with the glove was to pull fibers and hair off it? Or to look for fibers and hair on the glove?
That was a common source of investigation would be hairs and fibers because it's a common transfer material.
But your role with the glove was limited to looking for hair and fiber?
Well, it was trace evidence that might be meaningful, which typically would start with hair and fiber, but it could be other material.
In terms of your conclusions, the only thing you looked at in this particular case was hair and fiber?
The only thing I recovered were several fibers.
Okay. You didn't do any DNA testing on it?
I did not.
Okay. You're not going to have any conclusions about DNA?
No.
How about fingerprints? Did you anything with fingerprints on the glove?
No, just coordinating those services.
And you don't have any opinions or conclusions about whether or not there are fingerprints on the glove?
Correct.
All right. And your conclusion was that there were fibers on the glove, but that they were of no evidentiary value?
Nothing of apparent useful value at the moment.
Thank you. That's all I have, Judge.
Any reason this witness shouldn't be excused, Mr. Merchant?
No.
Ms. Hart?
No other questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you for your testimony, sir. You're welcome to stay, go, but you'll be released at this time. The only thing I'll ask of you is don't discuss the testimony you've given here to this jury this afternoon with any other witness in the case until the case is concluded, okay?
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Call your next witness.
Can I call Philip Prater to the stand?
Okay. No. Good afternoon. Is this Mr. Prater? Good. Before you're seated, please raise your right hand. You swear or affirm the evidence you're going to provide in the hearing of this case is going to be the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, sir.
Good. Thank you so much. Please be seated and give your attention to Ms. Hart.
Let me get you to introduce yourself to the jurors, please.
My name is Philip Prater, and I work for Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab in Latent Division.
And you kind of have a soft voice, so I'm going to need you to speak up a little bit for me. You said you work at the crime lab in what area?
In Latent Division,
Okay. And in the latent print division, what is your job?
I'm a latent print tech.
Okay. What does a latent print tech do?
Well, we get evidence from the examiner and we examine it. Not examine it, but we work with work with the examiner to figure out how's the best way of getting the best results.
Okay. So now, to be clear, are you trained to actually look at fingerprints or palm prints and say this is of comparison value?
No, I'm not.
Do you work with the person who does that, though?
Yes.
Now, do you have any training as it relates to what techniques can be used to attempt to lift these latent prints?
Can you repeat that question one
Yes.
more time, please?
Are you familiar with what techniques or things that can be used to attempt to lift these latent prints or to make them more visible?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and what are some of the techniques or things that you use in order to try and assist the latent print examiner in finding those prints?
Well, we have Superglue that we use to put in a chamber, and we heat it up, and Superglue appears onto the evidence, and that's one of the techniques. And another technique that we use dye staining. Dye stain the evidence and see can we get any type of result from that.
Thank you. Now, direct your attention to 2005. I'm going to use that in just a second. Sorry, yes. I want to direct your attention to 2005. Were you working at the crime lab in 2005?
Yes, I was.
And in what capacity were you working at the crime lab in 2005?
Latent print tech.
And did you have an occasion in this particular case to examine any items of evidence for potential fingerprints or any prints?
Not examined.
Okay. Did you have an occasion to work with an examiner to attempt to try and see if you could get any information or you could find latent prints? The examiner could find them.
Yes.
Okay. May I first witness, Judge? Sure. I'm going to show you what have been marked as State's Exhibits 153 through 166. Ask you to take a look at each of those for me, please, and tell me if you, after you've had a chance to look at those, tell me if you recognize those.
Yes, I recognize these.
You do recognize those?
Yes, I do.
And as to each of those exhibits, are they true and accurate depictions of the glove as it existed during the time that you were assisting the latent print examiner?
Yes, some pictures that I remember, yes, they are.
Okay. Your Honor, this time I would tender in evidence State's Exhibits 153 through 165.
165?
166.
166. Thank you, Mr. Merchant. Those be admitted without any objection.
Okay. Let's start looking at State's Exhibit 153. And are you able to see that on the screen in front of you, sir?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury what they're looking at in that particular picture?
Okay, the picture that I have shown here, I took a medial picture of the evidence. I took it out the bag and placed it onto the table and took a picture of the glove that I received it in.
Okay. Now you indicated you took it out of the bag. I'm going to show you what's already been introduced as State's Exhibit 170A. ask you to take a look at that for me, please? And can you tell me if you've ever seen that bag before?
My initials on here, so
Okay.
yes.
And given that your initials are on there, what would that mean to you about that particular bag?
That I open the bag and I initial it once I'm done.
Okay. So when we see PP here on the bag, would that be where you have resealed the bag after you were done with it?
That's correct.
Now, at some point, and I don't want to go into what anyone specifically told you, but at some point, was a decision made that this particular glove would be cut into pieces?
We kind of find out what the best result will give for the each division, for the biology division and even the latent print division. So the glove, to get contact DNA on the glove and latent prints, we figure out that the glove has to be cut so they won't interfere with each other.
Okay. And was this glove cut?
Yes,
Who cut this glove into pieces?
I did.
I'm going to put 154 on the screen. Can you describe to the jury what we're seeing in this particular picture?
Okay, what you have here, what shown here on this image here, the gloves that I cut the fingers and I nubbin them to each position, the position on the glove, and I cut off the middle portion of the glove, separate from the base of the glove, and the middle of the glove is the indication that that's goes into biology degree. We're into biology.
Okay, so I didn't ask you this before, but to be clear, this picture that we saw earlier of the glove, is that going to be, is it going to be the same side that, I'm asking this poorly, did you turn this glove inside out after it was given to you from Larry Peterson?
No, I did not.
Okay. So would this be in the same condition as what Larry Peterson gave it to you?
Yes.
So then going back to State's Exhibit 154, again, the portions that we see labeled on the outside, is that what would have been on the outside when you received it from Larry Peterson?
Well, once an examiner gets the glove, they examine it as a whole, make sure nothing that I cut into or anything like that. They look at it and examine it, and when they say it's good to the cut, then I cut it.
Okay. But did you turn it inside out before you cut it?
No, I did not.
Now, you talked about some of the pieces, and you referenced a middle piece. Would that be what we're looking at here?
Yes.
And with your hand, can you show the jury, just so it's clear to them, what portion of the hand that portion of the glove would have been from?
I don't know if it's right hand or left hand, but the portion of it came right here in the middle, right here.
And what did you say occurred to that piece that was in the middle of the glove? Where did it go?
To biology.
And then what about the pieces that we see of the fingers that you numbered and also the palm area? What happened to those?
The fingers that I have numbered here is indication from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the base of the glove that stayed in latent prints.
Okay. So when you say they stayed in latent prints, did you do further work with them?
Yes, I did.
In this particular case, did you use any of those methods or techniques that we talked about earlier to try and make the prints more visible?
Yes, I did use technique.
And what techniques did you use?
Once an examiner looked at the gloves, he, well, at that time, with Tim Small, he looked at the gloves and he told me, okay, you can go ahead and fume it. After he looked at it from doing his visual.
Okay. Now, when you say fume it, what do you mean? What does that mean to you?
Use super glue.
Okay. And did that occur in this case?
Yes.
Were there any other techniques used other than the super glue to try and lift any prints from this particular item?
No.
Okay. going to show you States Exhibit 155 on the screen. Sorry. And can you tell the jury what they're looking at in States 155?
Okay. I'm sorry, man. Look at my notes.
Of course.
Yes. Yes. Okay. By looking at this image here, that we process it and we cut it a little bit more to get it to lay out to look at the prints and marked it on there to show where we want the photograph of.
Okay. Why is it now a different color?
We use rotamine, that's a dye stain.
You use what?
Rotamine.
Okay. And is that different than the superglue you just talked about?
Yes.
What's the point of using that dye stain?
That dye stain right there, that is a fluorescent dye stain. It's a fluorescent when you put a light source. And the type of light source that I used was, what we used was 525 nanometer.
Okay. And again, is that something that is commonly used in your field to attempt to be able to identify these, what we call latent prints?
Yes.
Now, the next few exhibits that we're going to look at, I don't need to necessarily know what portion of the glove they come from, okay? But I do want to talk about them just generally. So looking at 156, and if you know what portion it comes from, that's fine. But 156, is this, can you tell the jury, is this a portion of that same glove?
Well, I do not know for sure, but it is the glove that is marked with my initials on there.
Okay. And then again, States 157. What are we looking at there?
That's a glove, that's the palm of the glove.
Okay.
That is marked as well on my initials.
158.
That's another area of the fingerprint glove.
Okay. 159.
That's another area of the fingerprint glove.
160. You back it up some?
Yeah, I'm not we got it zoomed in, so I really can't say where it's from, but it's marked with my initials.
Okay. And then States 161.
That's the area of the palm with my initials.
162.
That's another area of the glove.
Okay. This is 163.
That's another area of the glove.
And 164.
That's another area of the one of the fingers.
Sorry. To be clear, would y'all be, once you cut it, are you going to look at both sides of the glove?
That's correct.
Okay. So could some of these pictures be the opposite side of the other picture?
Yes, it could be.
States 165.
That's another area of the palm.
And I apologize, I interrupted you.
Yeah, that's okay.
And then states 166. What would that be?
It's another area of glove, it's a finger.
Okay. Now, once this is done, once you've used the super glue and the dye stain, and these pictures are taken, do you have any further interaction with this glove, or at that point is it turned over to latent print examiner?
It turns over to the latent print examiner.
Okay. And in this particular case, who was the latent print examiner?
Tim Small.
No, I don't have any further questions at this time.
Mr. Merchant, any cross-examination?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Any reason Mr. Prater shouldn't be excused going about his business?
No, Your Honor.
Good deal. All right, Mr. Prater, thank you for your testimony, sir. You're welcome to stay, go whatever you want to do. You'll be released at this time. The only thing I'll ask is please don't discuss the testimony you've given to this jury today with any other witness in the case until the case is concluded, okay?
All right.
Thank you so much, sir. Have a good day.
Thank you, sir.
Call your next witness.
Another state calls Timothy Small.
Sure. Affirm the evidence you're going to provide here in this trial is going to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So have you got it?
Yes, Your Honor.
Good deal. Thank you so much. Please be seated. If you'll give your attention to Mr. Rigby there, he'll direct your testimony.
If you'll introduce yourself to the jury, please.
My name is Timothy John Schmall. I currently am the Assistant Laboratory Director for the U.S. Postal Inspection Service Forensics Laboratory.
And if you will, for the court reporter, if you'll spell your first, middle, and last name for the court reporter, please.
First name, Timothy. Middle name, John, John. Last name is Schmahl.
And Mr. Schmall, you said you were currently employed with the U.S. Postal Service, is that right?
Yeah, Postal Inspection Service. Yes.
Postal Inspection Service. And how long have you been employed with the Postal Inspection Service?
Since October of 2020.
Now, and what do you do for the U.S. Postal Inspection Service?
I'm the Assistant Laboratory Director over the Fingerprint APHIS unit.
And you've been doing that now for a little over a year or so?
About a year and a half, yes.
Year and a half. Prior to working for the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, how were you employed before that?
I was with the Houston Forensic Science Center. I was the manager of their latent print section for 6.5 years.
And when you say Houston, where are you talking about?
Houston, Texas.
Now, I want to direct your attention back to 2005, specifically in October and following of 2005. How were you employed in 2005?
I was a forensic latent print examiner with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation.
And so when did you begin your work with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab?
It was September of 2005.
So when you did analysis in this case, how long had you been with the GBI?
believe my report said November, so that would have been about 2.5 months, maybe.
All right. Now, prior to working with the GBI for those 2.5 months in 2005, if you'll give the jury the benefit of your training and experience that allow you to do your job as a latent print examiner, please.
Yes, for 2005.
I'm going to try that at this point. Yes, sir.
Okay. Prior to being employed by the GBI, I started and ran the crime scene unit for the Griffin, Georgia Police Department. During my tenure there, running the crime scene unit for 5 years, I started taking classes. I had to do fingerprint comparisons. And Luke Wenday, who was the manager of the GBI section at the time, I would do comparisons, and he was mentoring me basically, and I would send him my comparison results, but I would still send the final evidence up to GBI, and he would confirm or refute. Basically, they would work the case all the way through. They'd have a primary examiner, examine it, and then have a secondary verifier, either agree or disagree with their findings, and they would issue a final report. So at the time, I wasn't issuing reports to my identifications. I was still technically kind of in training under Lou informally, and then I was offered a position with GBI in, like I said, September 2005. So.
And what kind of training, I know you mentioned being mentored by those in the GBI lab section, what kind of training do they do with you to prepare you for that, in addition to the other with Griffin Police Department as well?
Yes, there's a whole, the whole training program. I was in an accelerated program because I came to GBI with experience, comparison experience. I had to learn the whole biological aspects of friction ridge skin, as it's formally called, of your fingers, and then also comparison techniques and things of that nature. So learn about the history of fingerprints, where it started, key authors throughout the history of fingerprints, things of that nature. So.
And if you will, give the jury the benefit of kind of what is a fingerprint and how a fingerprint is left behind.
A fingerprint is basically, it's a chance reproduction of the friction.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry, Mr. Merchant.
I'll try to speak up, Judge. We object to this line of questioning. It's outside the scope of the summary that the state provided, and it's outside the scope of his written reports.
I don't have the benefit of the reports here, but I'll hear from you.
Judge, we provided Mr. Small's CV, his curriculum vitae, for all of his experience that's provided before. He's testifying about his reports where he was a latent print examiner back in 2005, and it's a subject report. He has to know what a fingerprint is. It's part of all encompassing of that very thing.
Anything further? Mr. Fargo? I'm going to overrule that objection. Thank you. Go ahead.
And Mr. Small, with regard to that, you've had experience since 2005 as a fingerprint examiner as well, is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And you're still currently employed. Have you always been employed since 2005 in some part of latent print examination?
That's correct.
All right. Now, with regard to that, let's talk generally about fingerprints. What is a fingerprint?
Right. A fingerprint, it's like I said, it's a chance reproduction of the friction ridges that are found on the palms of your hands, fingers, and the soles of your feet. Depending on you touching things, the residues left on the friction ridges of the raised area of the skin left behind you can actually develop a fingerprint. A latent print is technically an invisible print that needs some kind of enhancement, either chemically or physically, such as black powder or a chemical enhancement.
So if you actually look on something and see a print on something, what's that called?
That's called patent print.
Right. So if there's an invisible print and you use something to actually develop it and see it, what is that called?
At that point, it's technically a patent print, but we still refer to them as latent prints because we actually use the medium to actually visualize it, make it visible to the naked eye.
And what kind of medium do you use to make a fingerprint more visible? What are the options? Judge, I would tender him as an expert in fingerprint analysis. A formal tender is not required by the rules, but I will formally tender him as a
All right, any objection on board eye?
No objection as to his current qualifications, Judge, but I just want to make sure that he had been tendered so that I can make the appropriate objection because it's scope of his opinion.
All right, he's tendered, and there's no objection to his expert field of fingerprint.
Latent print examination.
Latent print examination. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as you recall with Mr. Peterson, who was here a few minutes ago, he was tendered and accepted as an expert in trace evidence analysis. this Mr. Small's field is latent print examination. Expert witnesses can give their opinions based on things as opposed to lay witnesses who generally are not authorized to give opinions. Give his testimony whatever weight and credibility you believe it's entitled to, okay? Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Rigby.
What options do you have to develop a latent print?
There's a whole slew of options. Depends on the substrate that you're actually dealing with, which is basically what's the item made of that you're actually dealing with. There's two primary surface types or evidence types in latent print. That's porous evidence and non-porous evidence. A non-porous piece of evidence is if you imagine taking a drop of water and say on this tabletop, drop that drop of water on the tabletop. This seems varnished, so I don't think the drop's going to actually soak in. It's going to rest on the surface until basically either it evaporates or something comes along to actually wipe it off the surface and destroys the print. So a non-porous item with a latent print resting on it, that's a very fragile print because that print is basically just resting on the surface. A porous piece of evidence, that's actually the best piece of evidence to actually try and develop a print from, because if you take that same drop of water and imagine a piece of paper, you drop that drop of water on the paper, it's going to rest on the surface and it's slowly going to sink into the paper and be absorbed. Same concept with the latent print residue. It's going to rest on the surface and it's going to slowly absorb into the porous substrate and be locked in there until some kind of chemical is actually applied to it. So in order to develop porous substrates, there's a number of chemicals out there. The main ones that are used in the field, or in use now in laboratories, is a chemical called indane-dione. Also, there's another chemical called DFO that, and then you actually have to use a sequential processing when you process something because it's been found through research that you have to apply one chemical before you can go to the next chemical. You can't go out of order. So with indane-dione, it's generally not visible to the naked eye. You have to apply an alternate light source or various wavelengths of light and use a bandpass filter that filters out some of the reflection that comes back. And so those prints are actually fluorescent. And so you can get those, you photograph those, you capture those photographically, pardon me. The next chemical you use is a chemical called ninhydrin. Ninhydrin reacts with amino acids in the prints and it stains the prints purple, so it's a visible reaction. For a non-porous surface, generally we start off with a visual exam with alternate light source because sometimes you can have an inherent luminescent print where some of the properties within the print are actually fluorescent on their own. It's rare, but it does happen. So you always do a visual on it. Generally next we go to the workhorse, which is superglue fuming. Cyanoacrylate ester is the official name of superglue. Superglue is heated up in a humidity chamber, and basically the superglue fumes adhere to the print residue that's resting on the surface. It actually polymerizes. So it basically forms a hard crust on top of the print, and it helps one protect it, and also you can also visualize it then because it was like an off-white color. Especially if you have a light colored background, sometimes it's hard to see. So then you move on to your dye stains. There's a number of dye stains out there. The majority, the big dye stain that is used out there is R6G, Rhodaman 6G. Typically, it basically just stains the superglue fumes. Basically, it needs some type of a carrier to be applied to the print. So typically, it'll be a methanol or a water-based. There's also I'm drawing a blank. Acetone. Acetone is recommended for using on cardboard because it helps develop the print better. So those are just a number of chemicals that are out there, and those are the main ones that are used at the laboratories that I've worked at. So.
All right, thank you. I'm going to show you what's been previously marked as State's Exhibits 126 through 132, and ask if you'll have a look at those, please, sir.
Okay. There's my initial. Okay, sir.
Are you familiar with those items?
Yes.
And how are you familiar with those items?
It's my handwriting across the top, and it also has my initials on each latent lift card.
And with regard to each of these latent lift cards, being States Exhibits 126 through 132, that your initials with regards to is on each of those items, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And were you asked to do an examination with regard to those cards?
Yes, I was.
All right, and if you'll tell us about that, please.
Typically, when latent lifts are submitted in, the first step in the process is to analyze the latent prints. We're looking for features contained within the prints themselves, such as, first we're looking at we're evaluating the quality of the prints and the quantity of the features that are inside the prints. If the quantity is not there, then we determine, and we don't think basically it can be used for a comparison, then we'll call it no value. If there's enough features contained within the print, which is referred to as minutiae, which is it has two main things. It's a bifurcation and ending ridges on your fingers. Bifurcation, if you can imagine basically a wishbone. A print is flowing along and it splits just like a wishbone. Ending ridge, that's just what it is. It's an ending ridge. It's flowing along, it just stops. So those are the main things that we're looking for. And that's a level 2 detail, but we're also looking for distortion within the print. As I refer to the quantity of detail in there, we're looking at the quality as well. Generally, we don't work with pristine prints because generally someone doesn't just put their hand down on something and take it back up. There's twisting, there's shearing motion, so we have to take that into account also when we're analyzing the prints. So a print can have a lot of detail, but basically the print itself, there's so much distortion that you can't really call it a value. So.
Now, with regard to these items, were you able to develop prints? Let me just talk about that first. You said prints of value. Can you describe the difference between a print of value and a print that doesn't have value?
Right. A print that we determine that is of value for comparison purposes, that we've determined that basically there's enough information contained within that print that if you're comparing, you can compare that to an actual fingerprint card, a record. So.
And then if they didn't have value, then it wouldn't be sufficient to compare to anyone.
Correct.
I sustain that objection.
What would no value mean?
No value means you cannot use the print for comparison purposes to anybody.
Now, with regard to these items, States Exhibits 126 through 132 that you examined in November this I think be January of 2006. Were you able to determine prints of value from those cards?
Yes, various latent lift cards have prints of value on there, and it's indicated by a V and then a dash with a numerical indicator indicating how many prints were actually determined to be of value on each individual card.
Now, were you asked to compare those to various persons through the course of your through your examination?
Yes, I was.
All right. With regard, I'm going to be specific. You had probably a long list of persons and cards to compare to. Is that right?
Yes, if I recall correctly, yes.
All right. And did you compare those prints to a Heath Dykes?
I can't recall.
Okay. If I show you your report, would that assist you in that?
Yes, if I see an official report that I did a comparison, yes. This report is just stating that I determined there was prints of value. There wasn't a comparison on this one.
My apologies. I was looking at this case, the list up there.
Oh, okay.
So there were no, in that regard, that was not listed on this report. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
My apologies. Now, I want to direct your attention to another item, which is showing you States Exhibit 154.
Okay.
Ask if you'll look at that, please, sir. Are you familiar with States Exhibit 154?
Yes, I am.
And what is States 154?
It's a photograph of an image of a latex glove that's been sectioned apart. The 5 fingers have been taken apart, individually labeled 1 through 5, and those are generally referenced to the finger number on a 10 print record. Your right thumb is generally a number 1, index finger is number 2, so that's why the label is 1 through 5. The interdigital area, which would be this area of the palm here, is...
I'm going to display it on the screen.
Okay.
That way when you're talking about it, they can see it. All right, so I have States Exhibit 155 on the screen. If you'll tell us about that, please.
Yes, right below the fingers, you'll have a section of the glove that would have been in the interdigital area, right below the fingers. That's been sectioned out, which is this area right here. And then the bottom piece is the full palm of the glove. So.
And were you asked to do an examination of the glove and this portions of the glove?
Yes.
All right, and who is Philip Prater? Do you know him?
Yes, I know Philip.
And who is Mr. Prater?
Philip is the processing technician at GBI, Georgia Burn Investigation. Typically, how it worked back then is his office was right across Allers Processing Laboratory. We had the option of processing our own evidence as examiners, but generally we let Philip process the evidence. Philip would actually he would consult with us if he actually developed something on it. He would come over across the hall. He would grab me and say, "Hey, will you come look at this?" So I'd get out, come out. I was like, "Yeah, we need to photograph that," or "No, it's no good. Just keep moving."
Now, in 2005, when these things were examined, how was the photography done? Did Mr. Prater do the photography at that point?
No, we did not. There was an actual photography unit that we'd send it over to the photographer, and we'd have areas specifically marked that we needed the photographs of. So.
Now, with regard to the item that's there on the screen, which is States Exhibit 154, were you asked to do an analysis on that item?
Yes.
Now, did you, when you were doing the analysis on that, what analysis did you do on those items? I guess I should say it that way first.
At each stage of the processing, basically, I would examine the evidence and let Philip know, yep, keep going, or basically send it for photography.
Okay. And what kind of processing did y'all do for these items?
I believe standard practice is generally do visual. I'm not sure if we did that back then. But this was superglue viewed. I believe nothing was seen on the after the superglue fuming, and a dye stain was applied. So.
Okay. And I'm going to show you on the screen what's been marked as States Exhibit 166. Is the dye stain depicted in this particular photograph?
Yes.
And how is it depicted in this photograph?
It's a purplish reddish color. That's R6G. That's actually stains the latent prints. But you can also have a background staining as well.
In regard to the items with regard that are on the screen there before you, can you tell us the results of your analysis regarding those items, please?
As they appear here?
Yes, sir.
There, it was determined that there was no visible prints.
Okay. And then what did you do from there?
Philip would have superglued it, and I would have came back and viewed it, and I don't believe there was any prints developed with superglue, and so we moved on to a dye stain.
All right, so you did the first, what was the first comparison that you did?
Just examining the evidence, just determining if there was any friction ridges visible there without having any kind of processing at all.
And you didn't see any at that point?
No.
So you did the second stage, which was what?
Superglue fuming?
And were you able to see anything at that point?
No.
And what did you do third?
Philip applied the R6G dye stain, and there was friction ridges that were developed that I determined that, hey, let's send this for photography so we further analyze these prints.
When you say friction ridges were seen, tell me what you mean by friction ridges.
Friction ridges, latent prints, had developed to where basically they could be visually seen under an alternate light source.
Okay. And was that done in this case?
Yes.
Right. And once you had done this third stage and it was photographed, did you come back and analyze it again?
Yes, I analyzed the photographs. At that point, after R6G, all processing of evidence stopped as far as latent print goes, and then the photographs of the images that were captured of the developed latent prints, they were analyzed by me.
Right. And when you analyzed them there in 2005, what did you determine once it came back to you after that third stage?
I determined there was one latent palm print of value on the latex glove.
When you say a print of value, what does that mean?
I mean, it can be used for comparison purposes. There was enough detail developed within this palm print that if compared with the right candidate, that an identification could be effective.
Okay. And let's see. Now, in 2005, was the technology at the crime lab, was it the same as it would have been in 2017?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, with regard to that, let me ask you just a couple of things. Are you familiar with something called the DCS system?
Yes, I am.
And what is that?
Excuse me. The DCS system is a proprietary system that was developed by Foster and Freeman. That's a forensics supply company. DCS is digital capture system. It basically integrated a software package into it where the DCS-3, as it was being used back then, only had 3 different wavelengths of light, I believe. It was on a little push box, and it was LEDs. So it was new technology. It also had a photo enhancement software suite. But we had just got the system in, and we were still basically proficiency performance testing it and writing SOPs in order to use it for casework. It wouldn't be able to be used for casework at that point.
All right. Now, with regard to that, has that system been updated since 2005?
Yes, it has.
All right. And also specifically, are you familiar with something called AFIX, a computer system developed called AFIX?
Yes, I believe it's AFIX Tracker, as it's called.
All right. And at 2005, when you were doing your testing, was that used with the GBI when you were doing this testing?
No, it was not.
Your Honor, that's all I had.
Okay, any cross for Mr. Small? Mr. Murphy?
Good afternoon, Mr. Small. My name is John Merchant. I represent Mr. Duke. You and I have talked before, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So in this case, your sole job was to determine whether or not there was a print that could be viewed closely enough to analyze for comparison.
Correct, yeah. I was determining if the latent print was of value. If we developed any latent prints, if they were actually of value so you could actually compare it or not.
You didn't do any comparison yourself.
No, I did not.
At the time that you did your analysis on the glove, how long had you been at the GBI?
I think 2.5 months.
So that meant you were being supervised by a senior examiner?
Correct.
And that senior examiner reviewed all of your work
That's correct.
and reviewed your conclusions?
That's correct, yes.
And the examiner in this case agreed with your conclusion that there was one latent print of value?
I don't believe that examiner viewed the actual print.
But agreed with your conclusion?
Yes.
When we spoke in 2019, you said latent print science is a subjective conclusion based on the totality of the circumstances. Do you still agree with that?
Yes.
And you told me the science is subjective. The examiners have to use their brain. Is that true in your
Correct.
view?
Yes.
Would you agree it's generally harder to get prints, usable prints off porous surfaces?
No, it's actually the opposite.
Okay. How about a latex glove? Would it be harder to get a print off a latex glove than, say, a countertop?
It depends.
The substrate itself makes it difficult to pull a print off, does it not?
True, yes.
And the process that you used, you had to use 3 separate processes in order to be able to see enough of a print to photograph it. Is that true?
That's correct, yes.
That's all I have. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Any follow-up, Mr. Rigby?
Just very with regard to your analysis and finding the latent print, you talked about using photographs, is that right?
Correct, yes.
And the photographs you used, were they color or black and white?
All the photographs that I've been shown from back then are color photographs.
Okay. With regard to looking for and developing latent prints, does it make a difference whether the photo is color and black and white, or color or black and white?
Yes, actually it does. Latent print examiners, for the majority, operate in a grayscale area. When I say grayscale, generally it's practiced nowadays to, if you photograph a print and it's in color, you're going to use, say, a general program like Photoshop. And you're going to grayscale that image. And also, if you grayscale an image, it could be, you could have white ridges on a dark background. You would have to reverse the color there in order to have black ridges on a lighter background. So using photo enhancement software, you can better enhance prints to basically tease out more of the detail that basically you won't be able to see using a color photograph.
So which would be better to look at, black and white or color?
Black and white, yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Any follow-up, Mr. Murphy?
Based on that, you understand that Jesse Worley, another examiner at GBI, reached a different conclusion about the number of usable or suitable latent prints, correct?
That's correct.
And
100%.
she reached a different conclusion in terms of finding more, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
She found 3, whereas you found 1.
Correct, yes.
And I know we talked about this in 2019, but back then, and I want to know if you still agree, you as you analyzed the glove, you had no idea what the original outside of the glove was, correct?
You could tell.
But you didn't know for certain, correct?
Not 100% certain, no.
Okay. And you didn't make any findings or conclusions as to what was the original outside of the glove as part of your work?
It was the entire glove as a whole, both inside and outside, I guess.
Right. And by the time you got it, it was cut?
That's correct.
Okay. That's all I have, Judge. Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right, back up.
Mr. Smalley, when the defense attorney cut you off, you said you could tell which was the outside and the inside of the glove.
Judge,
right?
Jack, he's characterizing my questioning. I think we don't need to do that.
I was directing him back to the answer he was giving, and I needed to do that how it said.
All right, I would rule that objection. Go ahead.
When you were saying you could tell, talking about the glove, tell me what you meant by that.
Looking at it, that particular glove type, not all latex gloves, but certain light-colored latex gloves, as the hand sweats inside the glove, you're going to see discoloring on the glove. As in the photograph that's on the screen, you can actually see that visible discoloring. So if the discoloring is darker on one side of the glove and it's not dark on the other side, then not 100%, but I'm pretty certain that the discoloring was the actual interior of the glove.
And as we discussed earlier, at the time that you examined and found one palm print,
how long had you been with the GBI at that time?
2.5 months.
And you were working with different technology than Ms. Worley would have worked with in 2017, is that correct?
That's correct.
That's it.
All right, another shot, Mr.
Just one question, sir. Were they the same photographs that were taken? If Miss Worley used the same photographs you used?
I do not know.
Objection, speculation.
All right. Any reason Mr. Small shouldn't be excused to go on about his business from the state? Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Small. I'm going to excuse you at this time. The only thing I'm going to ask, please don't discuss the testimony you've given here today to this jury with any other witness in the case until the case is over, okay?
Okay, yes, sir.
All right, good. Have a great day. Thank you. All right, y'all ready for the first break of the afternoon? I see about 7 hands going up. All right, if y'all will please step to the jury room. We'll be right back with you about 10 minutes. Listen, you can tell the jury if they want to bring water out here while they're welcome to, just not Coca-Colas and stuff. All right, be in recess about 10 minutes. Thank you. both sides ready for the jury? Okay, thank y'all. Ask the jury to join us, please, Ms. Watkins. Call your next witness, please, Ms. Hart. Mr. Weathersby, is that right? Yes, sir. Good afternoon. Come on down right there, please. Before you're seated, please raise your right hand. You swear or affirm the evidence you're going to provide in the hearing of this case is going to be the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you. Please be seated.
Yes, sir.
Give your attention to Ms. Hart. She'll direct your testimony.
You should introduce yourself to our jury, please.
My name is Special Agent Franklin Leadell Weathersby.
And how are you, call yourself a special agent, where do you work?
I work at the Region 13 office of GBI at Perry, Georgia.
What do you do at that office in Perry, Georgia?
I'm a crime scene specialist.
Can you tell our jury what is a crime scene specialist?
I go to crime scenes and I document them for court.
And can you tell us what sort of training and experience you have to be able to do that job?
Well, I'm a certified police officer. And then I went to a 17-week GBI school to become a special agent. And then I went to a specialized 10-week school called the National Forensic Academy. It's up at the University of Tennessee, also known as Body Form. I've also had another 4,800 hours worth of specialized training to be a crime scene specialist.
And how long have you actually been working as a crime scene specialist at the GBI?
For over 18 years.
And how much of that time have you been at the Perry office?
All of it as a crime scene specialist, but 22 years total at the Perry office.
So what did you do before you were a crime scene specialist?
I was a drug agent at a local drug task force, the Oconee Drug Task Force, and I did narcotics work and undercover work.
Now, directing your attention to October 24th of 2005, were you working in the Perry office at that time?
I was.
Normally, would you have been the crime scene specialist who would report to any potential crime scenes in Ocilla, Georgia?
Yes, ma'am.
However, did you handle the crime scene in this case?
I did not.
Do you, sitting here, remember why you didn't handle the crime scene in this case?
I was off because it was an opening weekend of deer season.
Okay. Now, however, throughout the years, have you had some involvement in this case?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, specifically, I want to direct your attention, was there ever a time in which you were at the home or the residence of Tara Grinstead after she went missing?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you have an occasion to collect any evidence from her residence?
I did.
This is going to be state 178. Identified as case 178, and can you take a look at that for me, please?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you recognize state 178?
I do.
How do you recognize state 178?
It's got my writing on it, has our case number, the date, time it's collected, the evidence receipt number, and my initials on the seal.
And from where did you collect that particular piece of evidence?
It was collected in the bathroom of Tara Grinstead's residence.
And is there more than one item inside that particular bag?
There is.
What other items did you collect from her residence in her bathroom specifically?
It was a toothbrush and 2 separate razors.
What was the purpose of collecting a toothbrush and razors from her bathroom?
To try to ascertain anything with Tara's DNA on it.
And why did you need to collect Ms. Grinstead's DNA at that point?
So if we would have an exemplar to go by if we ever located Ms. Grinstead.
And do you know the date on which that particular item was collected?
Yes, on 10/31 of 2005.
Now, after you collected it, what did you do with it?
It was maintained in my custody till I got back to my office in Perry and placed in the GBI Region 13 evidence room.
This particular bag that we're looking at, was it sealed?
It was.
And who sealed it originally?
I did.
And how do you know that?
It has my initials and my badge number and the date and time I sealed, or the date I sealed it.
Okay. And why is it written across the red tape?
So you can't move the tape and match it back up with another piece of tape.
Now, does it appear that this bag has been opened at any point since the time that you sealed it?
It does.
And looking at that, can you tell me, are you able to tell us where it appears that bag was opened?
Believe it would have been, I can't tell the initials, but it's got a date of 6/14/15,
Okay.
possibly at the lab or at the DA's office.
Other than that particular, that's been opened, the seal, is it in the same condition?
It is.
And that particular opening, is that obviously separate from where you sealed it?
It is.
I'm also going to show you what... I'm also going to show you it's the mark that states 179 and ask you if you recognize that.
Yes.
How do you recognize that?
This is a buccal swab kit, and it has my initials on it.
And from whom was that buccal swab collected?
Marcus Harper.
And after you collected that buccal swab, what did you do with it?
It was placed in this kit, sealed, has my initials and the date, and it was placed in the Region 13 evidence room.
Does it appear that has been opened at any time since you sealed it?
It does.
And after it was put in the evidence room, would that have been submitted to the crime lab?
It would have been.
Other than the one indication that it's been opened at some point, does it appear in the same condition as when you sealed it?
It does.
And just again, so we're clear, we're using the word buccal swab. What exactly is a buccal swab?
It's just a long wooden Q-tip swab that is used to collect cells from inside someone's mouth, which has to do, that's where buccal comes from, has to do with mouth.
In this particular case, how did you come to be collecting Marcus Harper's buccal swabs? Did you have a search warrant for that?
No.
Then how were you able to collect his buccal swabs?
They were given to me by consent.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, did you have an occasion to assist in or execute some search warrants as well?
I did.
And during the collection or the execution of those search warrants, at this point, did you obtain anything that you know to be of evidentiary value in this case?
No.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Ms. Murphy, any cross-examination?
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, Jen. How are you?
Afternoon.
We spoke previously. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. And you insisted on having a member of the district attorney's office present when we spoke?
I don't know if I insisted, but I did have a member of the district attorney's office present.
And you collected, I believe, 50 swabs of suspected blood from Ms. Grinstead's vehicle. Is that correct?
No.
That is not correct.
I and another person with the Warner Robins Police Department collected 50 swabs from the vehicle.
Okay. And you don't, so what part of that is incorrect? That it was suspected blood?
That it was suspected blood.
Okay. And did you collect 51 control swabs?
They did, yes.
Okay. And did you collect 29 possible DNA swabs?
Yes.
And 10 tape lifts from the vehicle?
We did.
Okay. May I approach, Judge? showing you an email from December 22nd, 2005. If you could take a look at that, let me know if it refreshes your memory about my question regarding suspected blood.
Yes.
Thank you. So let me ask you again. Did you collect 50 swabs of suspected blood?
I collected 50 swabs, some of which may have been suspected blood. I don't know how many of them were.
Okay. And when you were at the home on October 31st, and you did the luminescence, you did not find any evidence of blood in the home, correct?
I did not.
Okay. And another report, you indicated that you had a box of 117 swabs that you collected from the vehicle. Does that sound accurate?
Yes.
And once you collected all those 117 swabs, do you know what happened to them?
They are still, as far as I know, still in the evidence room.
Still in the evidence room. Okay. Do you have any knowledge of if they've been tested or not?
I know some were tested. I don't know how many.
Okay. And is that something that the tests are done at your request or at someone else's request?
Usually at the case agent's request.
Okay. And at the time, the case agent, it looks like was Dominic Turner. Does that sound right?
He was one that had been there, not at the time we processed the car. I think that was at a later date. He was the original case agent.
Okay. And at the time you processed the car, you said that it was pursuant to a search warrant. The search warrant that you got was for evidence of the crime of kidnapping at that point, correct?
I'm not sure. It could be. I don't have my report in front of me, so I wouldn't know.
Looking at the warrant, help refresh your recollection.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you.
Yes. It says kidnapping.
Okay. And so this warrant that was taken, December 6th, 2005. So that was after you had processed the residence on October 31st, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so the time that this warrant was taken out, it was for the evidence of crime of kidnapping, not a homicide, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. You ready?
I do. Just a couple questions. When you took that particular search, let me ask this differently first. In order to get a search warrant, can you just get a search warrant without a suspected crime?
No.
In this particular case, given that Ms. Grinstead was not at her home, that her phone was there, her dog and her cat were left, was there, in your opinion, sufficient probable cause that perhaps she had been kidnapped?
Yes.
Was there?
I overrule that affair.
What was your response to that?
Yes, ma'am.
Was that based on the evidence you had then at the totality of those circumstances?
Yes.
And given what you know about the case now, if you were to take a search warrant, would you list that same crime?
No.
Now, I want to talk about the swabs that you took from the vehicle in this case. Do you know the date on which you swabbed, or which you conducted the search on Ms. Grinstead's vehicle?
It was over several days.
Okay.
But it was at the end of the year, like in December.
December of what year?
I believe 05. I'm not sure without reviewing
Do
my
you
report.
have any knowledge as to where Ms. Grinstead's car was from October 24th of 2005 until the date that you conducted your search warrant on it?
Only in so much that I went back to her house on the 31st and it was still there.
The 31st of
October.
Okay. Other than that, do you have any idea where that vehicle was in the meantime?
Not till it was towed to my office, and I don't remember what date that was.
Do you know what month that would have been in?
I believe it would have been in December, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Do you have any idea how many people would have been in and out of that vehicle from the time from October 24th of 2005 till the time you conducted your search warrant?
No, ma'am.
Do you have any idea who might have had keys to that vehicle from the time that she disappeared until the time your search warrant was conducted?
No, ma'am.
And have you at some point learned whether or not her neighbor actually wound up having that vehicle detailed for her?
Yes.
Do you know if that occurred before or after you conducted your search warrant?
It occurred before.
Okay. At the time that you conducted the search warrant, did you have knowledge that he had already detailed the vehicle?
Yes.
So why do you still go ahead and try and collect swabs if the vehicle's been detailed?
To do whatever we can to solve the case.
As it relates to that particular vehicle, do you have any knowledge how many people were in that vehicle when it was being detailed?
No.
Do you have any knowledge of who drove it to the place to get it detailed?
No.
Do you have any knowledge of who drove it back from the place to get it detailed?
No, ma'am.
And in this particular case, well, I guess let me ask you first. When people are trying to lift fingerprints, generally, what kind of, if it's latent prints, what kind of materials do you use to try to lift latent prints?
Well, when you're trying to lift physical prints, we usually use fingerprint powder and a brush.
Okay. Does that leave a mess?
It does.
Understanding you weren't present on October 24th, 2005, do you know if anyone attempted to get fingerprints on October 24th of 2005?
Yes.
And do you know whether or not that would have left a big mess in her vehicle?
Yes, it would have.
And when you got the vehicle after it had been detailed, was that mess still there?
No.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
All right, any follow-up, Mr. Murphy?
Yes, thank you, Judge. The person that processed the vehicle on October 24th, was that Captain Anderson from Ben Hill, I'm sorry, Colonel Anderson from Ben Hill Police Department?
I believe he was, yes.
Okay, and so he processed the vehicle prior to it being detailed, correct?
Yes, that's my understanding. I wasn't there.
Okay, thank you.
All right, is that it?
Yes, Sean, thank you.
Agent, thank you for your testimony. You're welcome to stay. Go. I'm going to release you at this time. Only thing I'll ask is don't discuss the testimony you've given to this jury this afternoon with any other witness to the case until the case is concluded. Okay?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thanks so much. You're excused. Call your next witness.
Your Honor, the state will call Lisa Hobgood, and while she's coming in, may we approach for just a moment?
Please raise your right hand. You solemnly swear or affirm the evidence you're going to provide in the hearing of this case. It's going to be the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you so much. Please be seated there, and if you'll give your attention to Ms. Hart, she'll direct your testimony.
Can we get you to introduce yourself to the jury, please, ma'am?
Yes, my name is Lisa Hobgood. My last name is spelled Hobgood.
Okay. And Ms. Hobgood, how are you currently employed?
Currently, I'm employed as a forensic biologist at the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Laboratory.
Now, as a as a biologist,
Yes, ma'am.
what do you do for the Army?
Yeah, so typically we call it Army Crime Lab or USACIL. So if you hear me refer to it that way, that's what it means. That's where I work now. And at USACIL, I look at evidence submitted by different investigating agencies of all branches of the military. I can look for bodily fluids such as blood or semen. I can also perform DNA analysis if necessary.
Now, what sort of training experience and education do you have to be able to work as a criminal biologist?
So I have a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from the University of Georgia. And soon after I got that degree, I went to work for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in their crime lab. I was an intern in their latent print section. I was then a technician on a temporary basis in their toxicology section. But in July of 1997, I got hired in their serology DNA branch as a forensic biologist. It was there that I learned how to perform the tests, how to interpret the results. And during that time, I had several written exams, which I passed successfully. I had oral exams, which I passed successfully. And then I also had what we call practical exams. So mock evidence was given to me, and I had to obtain 100% accuracy on those results with everything that I learned. I did that. And then I started working as a forensic biologist until at the GBI until I left in April of 2006 and started working for the Army Crime Lab.
You talked about the practical portions where you had to have 100% accuracy. Those particular portions, are you dealing with samples that are known to other people in the crime lab to be able to know 100% certainty who it is?
Yes, they are actually samples that are made up. So they're not from actual cases. They're made up, so the person that makes these samples up, they know what the results should be.
And you said, what year did you leave to go to the Army Crime Lab?
2006.
And have you been employed there ever since?
Yes.
Now, I want to direct your attention back to 2005. In 2005, October of 2005 specifically, how long had you been working as a biologist?
I had been working as a biologist since 1997, so 8 years.
And at that time, any idea how many times you had an occasion to test samples for biological samples?
How many samples?
Any idea from the time that you started until 2005?
I would say in the thousands.
And as of today, would you be able to tell us how many times you had an occasion to do that kind of testing?
Probably tens of thousands by now.
Have you ever had an occasion to testify in court as to your findings?
Yes, ma'am.
Any idea how many times you've testified?
About 200.
And have you ever been tendered as an expert in any fields?
Yes.
Specifically, what fields have you been tendered as an expert in?
I've been tendered as an expert as a forensic biologist, also as a DNA analyst or forensic serologist, different titles.
Okay. You say different titles. Do they mean the same thing to you?
They do.
And any idea how many times you've been tendered as an expert?
Every time I've testified.
Have you been tendered in places outside the state of Georgia?
I have.
And any idea how many times you've been tendered outside the state of Georgia?
Probably 50 to 60.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time I would move to tender her as an expert in the field of forensic biology.
All right, any objection on board as to her qualifications?
No objection.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. Ladies and gentlemen, as with some of our previous witnesses, Ms. Hobgood has been tendered and accepted by both sides of this case as an expert in her field of forensic biology. Is that what
yes,
you
Your Honor.
tendered her in? Which authorizes her to give her opinions based on certain facts that are not known or in fields not known to the average juror. Give her testimony whatever weight you believe it's entitled to, just as you will any other witness. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Judge. I want to direct your attention to specifically October, November of 2005. Did there come a time in which you were asked to test items related to this particular case that we're here on today?
Yes, ma'am.
And understanding it's been a while and you don't work there anymore, have you had an occasion to review your notes as well as the reports you issued in this case?
I have.
I want to first start with what was labeled as item 1 at the GBI crime lab. What was item 1 in this case?
Item 1 is a latex glove.
And when you received this particular item, was it the whole glove?
No, ma'am.
What portion of the glove did you receive?
I received the portion that is basically the top of the palm all the way around to the knuckles on the hand. So just that area.
Without going into what anyone else said, were you familiar with any of the discussions that were going on at the crime lab of how best to utilize this glove?
No, I was not.
Let me ask this then. Generally, with a piece of evidence, are you able to get both DNA and prints from it?
Yes, ma'am.
And how are you able to do that?
Well, a lot of times we can, and it really depends. A lot of times, at least with my job now, we would consult, or I consult with a latent print examiner, and we kind of look at the evidence and they say, hey, don't test here, I see something here, but you can test in this area. Also, it can be superglue fumed, which is basically the item is put into kind of a tank and some superglue is heated up and the fumes will attach to the cells of the fingerprint. And depending on the item, we can actually swab that fingerprint as well.
Okay. You talked about you'll get with the fingerprint analysis person and figure out what to swab, what not to swab. Generally, when you swab something for DNA, would that affect the ability to lift the latent print? Or could it affect the ability to lift the latent print?
I'm not a latent print examiner, so I don't know that.
So then I guess my question is, why are you talking to latent print examiners to figure out where you're going to swab, where you're not going to swab?
Because we want to make sure that we do the best possible testing we can for the item. So if there's an area that a latent print examiner feels like is good for their testing, we try to avoid it so that we can get results from both DNA and latent prints as opposed to having to pick one or the other.
Do you know if that was done in this case?
I think so. Since I was given just this one strip of the glove, I would assume it was so that the rest of the glove could be preserved for other testing.
Direct your attention to the screen in front of you. This is State's Exhibit 154, and ask you to take a look at that for me, please.
Okay.
Now, looking at that particular document or that particular picture, do you see the portion of the glove that you were given to swab in this case?
Yes, ma'am.
And which portion was that in the picture?
It's the portion that's in the middle.
And when we say swab, what do you actually mean by that as a biologist?
So when I talk about swabbing, I actually take an item that looks like a Q-tip. It's a little bit different, has a longer stick, but it has the cotton end like a Q-tip does. And so that's a method that we use to collect DNA off of an item most of the time. And the way we do that is we actually take some sterile water and then put it on the cotton of the cotton swab and then swab the item of evidence. And then when we do DNA, we take that cotton swab and perform DNA analysis on that.
Okay. Now, I know we refer to it that looks kind of like a cotton swab, but are there measures in place to make sure that the swab you're using is not going to have anyone else's DNA on it before you use it?
Yes, they come in sterile packages.
Then are there precautions taken to make sure your DNA is not going to get on the swab that you're using?
Yes.
In this particular case, did you in fact swab the glove as we just discussed?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, when you swabbed the glove, did you swab the outside, the inside, or both?
I swabbed both.
And did you do that with one single swab or with different swabs?
With one single swab.
Now, I want to take you back to forensic biology in 2005.
Okay.
Was it the same as what we have now as far as what we could do with touch DNA?
No, ma'am.
Tell the jury what I mean when I say touch DNA, please.
Touch DNA is a loose term that we use. I mentioned before that I could do DNA on bodily fluids. So this is DNA not on that, just if someone actually touches, like if someone touches here, if I swab that, there's a possibility that I can pick up their DNA. So basically it's as a result of someone handling an item.
Okay. So you talked about bodily fluids. What are some of the bodily fluids that you can test in order to get someone's DNA?
The main three that have a large amount of DNA in them are blood, semen, and saliva.
Okay. When we talk about touch DNA, is that one specific kind of DNA or one specific part of the body that we're, like, is it skin cells you're testing? Is it sweat? What are you testing with touch DNA?
It's actually skin cells. So even if we tested something that sweat had dropped on, it's the skin cells in the sweat that we would be getting the DNA from.
In 2005, was the equipment that you were using for DNA testing, was it as sensitive as the equipment that you use now?
No, ma'am.
And I know you don't work at the crime lab, at the GBI crime lab anymore, but can you talk to the jury a little bit about what the science was that you were using back in 2005?
So back in 2005, the science I was using was very similar to what I'm using now, but there are some differences. The science I was using, the basic steps are the same. And by that I mean when we pull the DNA out of the cell, we basically do it the same way. The chemicals have changed. They're not as hazardous anymore. And then we copy the DNA using the same type of equipment that we used back then. But what's really different is back in 2005, typically we only tested items that came from bodily fluids or samples that came from bodily fluids because we knew that was enough DNA for us to be able to detect. This was the first case I ever did that involved just possibly someone touching something without a fluid. And back then, we were able to get DNA profile information at 13 areas all across someone's DNA. Now we can get it across 25, 27 areas. So basically the technology to find that DNA information is the same. It's just that it's more sensitive and we can see more information now.
Now, you just referenced that back then you could get 13 areas. What do you mean by areas of DNA?
So we call them loci. LOCI is how you spell it. And so when you look at the chromosomes, there are different areas that we look at, and the information or the instrument that we use gives us information at those 13 areas for an individual.
How many total areas are there of loci in DNA?
Oh gosh, hundreds of thousands.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how many can we get now?
So right now, in my job, I can get anywhere between 25 and 27, depending on the type of testing I'm doing.
When we were able to get the 13, as we did in this case, does that, if we're talking about there are a bunch of thousands or more, but we're only getting 13, how do we know that that's accurate information of somebody's DNA?
I'm not quite sure.
Well, I guess I'm trying to see, when you issue a report for DNA, do you give percentages of likelihood of a false match?
Yes.
Okay. And do you do that for every single time?
Well, we don't give, it's basically a statistic that we run if there's an inclusion. So we don't really give a statistic for a false match.
Yes, ma'am.
We can either give, as back in 2005, a frequency of occurrence, so how rare is this DNA profile information in a population, to whereas now we can actually give a likelihood ratio as to how likely some evidence is if it was generated by this person as opposed to another person.
And I probably should have started with this question, but I want to back up a little bit and just, as basic as you can you explain to the jurors what you mean by DNA?
Yes, DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it is something that is in every cell of our body. There are a couple of things to remember about DNA. One is that it's set at conception, and you get half from your mother and half from your father. The other thing to remember, or another thing to remember, is that generally your DNA profile does not change throughout your entire lifetime. And also your DNA profile is going to be the same as if you look at a white blood cell, that's going to be the same as your DNA profile from your hands.
Okay. Would any two people have the same DNA?
Well, we haven't tested everybody. So I can't say for sure, and that's why we do statistical analysis. That's why if we have an inclusion or we have where someone is matched, we generate a statistic, 1 in 1 million, that kind of thing, to give weight to that inclusion. If we had tested everybody on Earth, then we would be able to send a report saying, yes, it's this individual, but we can't do that.
Based on the people that have been tested thus far, have there been any people who actually have identical DNA?
Outside of identical twins, none that I'm aware of.
Okay. And the science that you do, is that based on what you just explained to us?
Yes.
Okay. So then let's move forward to this particular case. Why did you choose to swab the inside and the outside of the glove?
So in 2005, as I stated a little bit earlier, this was the first case that I did that involved touch DNA, that did not involve a fluid as far as I knew. So the thought process was to maximize the amount of DNA, because I didn't even know that I would get anything. I figured I probably wouldn't, because we usually needed a lot of DNA. So I swabbed both sides in order to maximize the sample to see if I could get any profile.
And generally with touch DNA, do you get as much of a sample of the DNA itself as you do from fluids?
No, ma'am.
And is there a correlation between that and why it's now easier to get touch DNA with the new science?
Yes.
Okay, can you explain that, please?
Yes, so the testing that we do now can detect a much smaller amount of DNA than back in 2005.
Okay. So when you swabbed this glove, were you the actual person that did the testing to see if you were able to identify any DNA?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you tell us, when you swabbed the glove, item 1, did it reveal any DNA?
Yes, it did.
And can you tell us, was that of one person or more than one person?
It was more than one. It was of 2.
Okay. Were you provided well, let me ask you this. Were you ever provided with DNA that was believed to have been that of Tara Grinstead?
I was provided with a toothbrush that was believed to have belonged to her.
Need some water or anything? No.
I'm good.
You okay?
May I press the list?
Sure.
I'm going to show you what's previously been marked as 178 and ask you to take a look at that for me, please.
Okay.
Do you recognize what that particular exhibit is?
Yes, I do.
How do you recognize that?
I recognize State's Exhibit 178 because it has the unique Georgia Bureau of Investigation crime lab number. It also has a description of what the item is. It also has my initials and date on the seal.
Okay. When this bag was received at the crime lab, was it in a sealed condition?
Yes.
And when it was opened, after you had tested it, did you put the items back in there?
I did.
And then did you seal it yourself?
Yes, ma'am.
Other than that, does it appear to have been opened in any other way?
Now, there's another area where it's been opened, but those are not my initials.
Okay, can you tell us what those initials are?
They look like AJH.
Okay. Now, do you know anyone that worked at the crime lab before you left who had the initials of AH?
No.
Okay. What is the date in which does it have a date with those initials?
It does. It's either June 14th or June 24th of 2015.
Okay. And would you have been working there in 2015?
No, ma'am.
The items that you put back in this bag, State's Exhibit 178, and sealed an initial, were those the same items that you were given?
Yes.
And what were the items that you were given related to State's 178?
There was a toothbrush in there, a green and white Oral-B toothbrush.
Okay. And were you able to utilize that toothbrush to obtain a DNA sample?
Yes, ma'am.
And going forward, was that DNA sample from that toothbrush used in examining what was found on the glove?
Yes, it became a sample that we used, and we put it in quotes in the report that it was from Tara Grinstead, since it was identified as being her toothbrush, and that was used to compare to other evidence.
Okay. And did you in fact compare the DNA that was taken from that toothbrush to either of the DNA samples found on the glove?
Yes.
What was the results of that?
So I did find that one of the profiles on the on the glove was consistent with the DNA profile of the toothbrush that was from Tara Grinstead.
Okay. And again, I know we're talking about 2005 science, but were you able to determine whether there was a major or a minor profile in the glove?
Not necessarily. They were pretty much equal.
Okay. And were you able to tell anything about the other DNA?
I did know that there was a male sample on there, but other than that, I didn't have any other identifying information at that time.
How did you know it was a male sample?
So one of the areas that we look at that I talked about earlier is an area that will tell me whether the sample is male or female. So if it's a female, that area will have a profile of XX. If it is a male, it will have a profile of XY. And so there is a Y at that area. So that lets me know if I have two people, one of them was consistent with the toothbrush of Tara Grinstead. I do have a male in there, and so the other sample is male.
And when you did the testing on the toothbrush that was identified as Tara Grinstead's, did you also do that testing to determine if it was male or female DNA?
Yes, that was female DNA.
Okay. At that point, were you ever asked to compare any known samples from males to the unknown sample on that glove?
Yes.
Sitting here today, can you tell the jury how many different males you personally compared to that glove?
I could tell you if I counted them up, but I would say dozens.
Okay. I want to talk about one specifically. Actually, two specifically. These have already been labeled and identified, so States Exhibit 144 and States Exhibit 179. I'm going to ask you to take a look at those and tell me if you need to look at your reports as well, let me know. Do you recognize either of those exhibits?
Yes, I do.
Do you recognize one of them or both of them?
I recognize one of them.
And which one is that?
It is States Exhibit 144.
How do you recognize States 144?
It has my initials and the date. It also has the GBI crime lab number on it.
Okay. And when you received States 144, would it have been sealed according to GBI protocols?
Yes.
And when it was removed at the crime lab, after it was tested, did you put it back in that bag?
Yes.
Since the time it's been put in that envelope, does it appear to have been opened again?
No, ma'am.
And so would that be in the same condition as when you last saw it?
Yes.
You're right. This time I would tender into evidence States Exhibit 144.
All right, any objection or voir dire to that document? That's admitted without objection. Thank you, Mr. Gibb.
Now, when you were given States 144, was it identified to you who that? Let me ask this first. What is States 144?
States 144 is a known buccal swab of Heath Dykes.
Okay.
A buccal swab is a swab from inside the mouth, and that's what we use as a known sample to compare two profiles obtained from evidence.
Do some people say that buccal swab?
Yes.
Any difference between a buccal swab and a buccal swab?
No, same thing.
Kind of like pecan and pecan?
Exactly.
Okay. So, in this particular case, did you compare the DNA sample from Heath Dykes to the unknown sample on the glove?
I did.
And what were the results of that?
I determined that Heath Dykes was excluded as a contributor as a source of DNA on the glove.
And I'm sure we all know what excluded means, but can you tell the jury, based on your examination of Heath Dykes' known DNA and the DNA from the glove, is there any way that Heath Dykes contributed that male DNA?
No, ma'am.
Looking specifically at your report that you did on 11/5/2005, do you have that in front of you?
I do.
As it relates to that specific report, I guess let me ask you first, would this have been the first report you did, or had you already done some more reports before this?
I believe this is my first report on this case.
And in this report, other than Heath Dykes, were there any other persons with whom you were asked to compare DNA?
Yes, ma'am.
Who was the other person with whom you were asked to compare their DNA to the unknown sample on the glove?
Anthony Vickers.
And did you do that?
I did.
And can you tell the jury what the results of that examination were in comparing the swabs from Anthony Vickers to the unknown sample on the glove?
I was able to determine that Anthony Vickers was not included as a contributor to the sample on the glove.
And I don't want to talk to you about every single one that you did, but I will ask this. Of all of the persons that you were asked to compare the DNA samples of, did you ever, in your analysis, find someone that matched the DNA from the glove?
No, ma'am.
Okay. While you were still at the GBI crime lab, were you the only biologist testing the glove, or were other biologists involved at that time, or do you know?
As far as I know, when I was there, I was the only biologist testing the glove.
Okay. I want to direct your attention to your report from December 5th of 2005. Can you tell us what that report reflects?
Yes, this particular report reflects the fact that I received several DNA samples from males and compared them to the information that was obtained from the glove.
Can you tell us who the samples were that you received as it relates to this report?
This particular report, I received samples from Anthony Mack, Larry Gaddis, James Hickey, Detective Bill Bars, Shannon Young, William Hamilton, Walter Calhoun, Howard James, Aldo Gifford, Andrew Griffin, Melvin Summerlin, and Jeffrey Lee, as well as Tracy Lamar Allen, and, sorry, I don't have my glasses on, Jordan Mobley.
Okay. In testing those persons, did any of their DNA match with the DNA that you obtained from the glove?
No, ma'am.
Now, I want to switch gears for a moment and discuss other items that you were requested to test other than the glove.
Okay.
Do you recall if you were ever asked to examine possible blood stains on a comforter?
Yes.
And can you tell us, did you do that?
Yes, the blood, or the comforter was tested for the presence of blood.
And did you do that?
We have, I reported it out. We had individuals that actually do the testing and then give me photographs of their results. I interpret those results and generate the report. So that's what happened in this case.
So I'm going to show you what's been identified as State Exhibit 125 and ask you to take a look at that for me, please.
Okay.
And, sorry, let me hold it over for you. Turn this down. Do you recognize States 125?
So States 125, I recognize it. It has the GBI crime lab number that is identified with this case, and it is described as being a comforter.
Okay. And does that appear to be based on the, does that appear to be the comforter that you would have tested in this case?
Yes, that was the comforter that I reported out the blood results on.
And specifically, is this listed as submission 6 in the crime lab?
I do not have, I don't think on the report it lists the submission number, so I don't have that in front of me.
But again, does this appear to be the comforter that you tested in this case?
Yes.
And at the time that you received it at the crime lab, or the crime lab received it, would it have been packaged in accordance with GBI protocols?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, at this time I would tender into evidence States Exhibit 125.
Any objection to 125? Thank you. That's been previously identified by Mr. Rossler as well, right?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. That's admitted without objection.
As to States 125, the comforter, did I understand you to say that a technical assistant would have actually done the testing, but you interpreted it?
Yes. So she did the testing and documented the test results. I then interpreted those, and that was what was happening at the lab at that time when I left. We had individuals doing the testing for bodily fluids because they're chemical color change tests, but then I interpreted those results and issued a report.
And based on your interpretation of the results of the analysis of the comforter, were you able to determine if that was in fact blood?
Yes, ma'am.
Was that blood compared to any other person's?
I don't have a record of that, of doing that testing. The testing on the comforter was done just a week or two before I left.
Okay.
So I would assume that if DNA was done on the comforter, it was done by someone else.
Understand. So you only interpret, as to the comforter, you only interpreted the blood?
Correct.
Now, as it relates to blood, let me ask you specifically, are you able to tell at any point, are you able to tell the source of the blood? For instance, whether it's from a wound or menstrual fluid or a nosebleed, is there any way to distinguish that?
No, ma'am.
And I guess, is there any way to distinguish that even as of now in 2022?
No, ma'am.
I'm going to direct your attention to a report that's dated 3/13/2016. I think you actually have two from that date.
Yes, ma'am.
So I want to look first at the one that the evidence says on 12/20/2005.
Okay.
Can you tell us, as it relates to this report, what you were asked to test?
So there were several swabs, and I don't know where they were taken from, but it was asked that these swabs be tested for the presence of blood.
When you say there were several swabs, how many swabs did you actually test as it relates to this report?
Is it okay if I refer to my notes?
Absolutely, if that will refresh your recollection.
I believe 13 were tested.
Okay. Of those 13, what were you testing for?
The presence of blood.
How many of those 13 tested positive for blood?
One of them tested positive for the presence of human blood. There were other swabs that tested positive for the presence of blood, but negative for the presence of human blood.
Okay. And based on your report, are you able to tell us what the item numbers were for these particular items that you tested?
Yes.
What was that?
It was item number 54. They were all in one package.
Okay. And does it specifically indicate an evidence number after that?
Yes.
And what was that evidence number?
E383065.
Is that a number that the crime lab would have assigned it, or would that have come in from the agency that submitted it?
I believe it came from the agency that submitted it.
May I have just a moment? I don't have any further questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Gibbs, any cross-examination?
DNA testing is advanced a lot since 2005.
Yes, sir.
And the testing now, I believe you testified, is much more sensitive than it was in 2005.
Yes, sir.
And the testing now can detect much smaller amounts of DNA than it could in 2005.
That's correct.
So it's entirely possible that the glove, when you tested it in 2005, that it had 3 or more people's DNA on the glove.
When I tested it, it did not.
But that was limited to the testing that you had available to you at the time.
Correct.
And so the testing now is more sensitive. And so it could be that it had 3 or more on there and you just didn't detect it.
That's correct.
Do you have any reason to dispute that the testing of the glove that was conducted in 2017, 18, and 19 in this case detected 3 or more people's DNA on the glove?
No.
And you never tested the glove for Mr. Ryan Duke's DNA?
That's correct. I never compared his DNA to the glove.
And you never tested for Mr. Bo Duke's DNA?
That's correct.
And speaking of Bo Duke's, if someone picked up the glove and dropped it, is that enough to leave touch DNA?
It's enough to leave touch DNA. Whether it's enough DNA to be detected, there are several factors that depend on that.
And those factors are if the person's hand was clean or if their hand was dirty, things like that.
Yes, sir.
And you mentioned earlier, but at the time you conducted the DNA testing, in this case in 2005, you never conducted touch DNA testing before that?
Personally, no, sir.
And so this was the very first time you've done it?
Yes.
When you were with the GBI, private attorneys, defense lawyers couldn't ask the GBI to conduct any specific testing, could they?
To be honest, I don't remember the policy. I don't ever remember being contacted by someone personally. I would think if they wanted it done, they would have to go through the submitting agency. But again, I don't remember the exact policy.
No further questions?
Ms. Hart, think of anything to follow up?
I do have a couple of follow-ups. Just to be clear, here, do you have any idea what happened with the testing of this glove from 2006 when you left the GBI crime lab?
I do not.
Okay. And when you were testing it back in 2005, how many DNA samples did you see on that glove?
I found DNA profiles from 2 individuals.
Now, how many times did you swab this glove? Once or more than once?
Just once.
And at the time that you swabbed both the inside and the outside of the glove, what was the ratio of the Tara's DNA to the other person's DNA?
It's about 50-50.
Defense counsel asked you about some of the factors that can cause touch DNA. Is friction something that can affect the amount of touch DNA you're going to get?
Yes, possibly.
Can you explain to the jury how friction can cause that?
So with touch DNA, there is not, even now, there is no sure and definite rule that if you touch an item for this long, you're going to get this much DNA no matter what. There are several factors that can affect how much touch DNA you can get or detect. One is if someone hasn't washed their hands, they're going to have more dead skin cells, and so when they touch an item, there's a possibility they would leave more than if they wash their hands. And sometimes it just depends on the individual. Something else that can determine whether or not you have more touch DNA, as Ms. Hart said, is friction, or how long are you rubbing something. Generally, you would expect that there would be more, and that probably is the case most of the time. And then also the type of item. So touching this, I may actually leave less DNA than if I touched my jacket because it's got a fabric and that can hold on to the cells. There's lots of things that determine whether we're going to get touch DNA and if we're going to be able to detect it and interpret it.
So let's say, what if someone's climbing a rope, just a regular old rope? Would you expect to get their touch DNA off of that rope?
Yes, ma'am.
Why is that?
Because it's an item that has a lot of fibers that can hold on to the DNA, and then if they're pulling on it, they're really rubbing their hands against it as opposed to just a light touch.
So what about if you climbed a rope, left your touch DNA, and then I climbed it behind you? Is there a possibility that your DNA from the rope is now going to be on my hand?
Yes.
And if you were to swab my hand after that, could you possibly get your DNA off of that?
Yes.
Okay. What about a steering wheel? If someone is gripping a steering wheel, is it possible that they could leave touch DNA behind?
Yes, ma'am.
Would different types of steering wheels affect the ability to get that touch DNA?
Yes, depending on the surface. If it was more rough, I would think there would be more DNA left behind.
And again, if someone let me ask you this. Is the amount of time someone drives that vehicle going to affect how much touch DNA you could get?
Maybe, maybe not, because when you're touching an item, you're also removing DNA, because if DNA is on there, it's going to transfer back onto the hand. So there's not a linear way to look at it and say the more they hold the steering wheel, the more that their DNA will be there, because most steering wheels are smooth, so I don't know. I could see it transferring both ways.
Back in 2005, were steering wheels always as smooth as they are now?
Well, no, not if people have covers on them and things.
Okay. And if, again, same example as the rope, if you've driven your vehicle and left your skin cells behind, and I then drive your vehicle behind you, is there a chance that I now have your touch DNA on my hands?
Yes.
And could I then leave both mine and your touch DNA on an item?
Yes.
That's all the questions I have.
Any follow-up, Mr. Gibbs?
And so as you sit here today, Ms. Holly, you have no opinion as to whether or not voting to DNA is on or not?
I do not have an opinion on that.
Thank you.
Okay. That it, Ms. Hart? Ms. Hobgood, thank you for your testimony, ma'am. You're going to be excused at this time. Don't discuss the testimony you've given here to this jury today with any other witness in the case until our case is concluded, okay?
Okay.
All right, thank you so much. You'll be excused at this time.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day. Okay, we out of witnesses today.
We are, Judge.
Suit y'all to head on to the bus. All right. Please leave your pads in the chairs, ladies and gentlemen, face down. Nobody will bother them. Once again, don't discuss this case with anybody or allow anybody to discuss it with you. If anybody tries to talk to you about this case, please report it to us when you come back in the morning. Please disregard any kind of television, newspaper, any reports like that. Y'all have any questions about anything? Same time tomorrow. See you then. Thank y'all. Have a good night. Does everybody remain in place while the jury leaves the courtroom?